Hi, James Ikeda here with part two of my series on the Black Freedom Movement. Today I want to talk about the subject of violence and nonviolence. And, this can be sort of a controversial topic. I'm not really interested in justifying or condemning or whatever. I'm more interested in digging into the ways that we talk about violence, the ways we talk about nonviolence, and what factors contribute to how we talk and think about these designations. Okay, so to begin with, the violence-nonviolence binary is, in my mind, a silly binary. I think it's not very useful. And the reason why it's not very useful is because it's disingenuous. When we use, in particular, when we talk about violence and nonviolence in the context of social movements, it is usually the case that these are kind of symbolic stand-ins, for something else. When we say violence and nonviolence, what we really mean is good or bad. If we're talking about social movements, talking about Black Lives Matter, then the word violence is a stand-in for bad, and the word nonviolence is a stand-in for good. Okay, um, so we're not really getting at the heart of the matter. And frankly, this is important for us to acknowledge because the reality of our world is that we actually have multiple different violence discourses, which is to say, we talk about violence differently depending on the context. And I can give you a few examples of this, and dig into the ways that language makes this more complicated. I mean, so for example, war. We talk about violence in war. War is violent. We know this, right? Okay. But when we talk about the casualties of war, the number of dead people, in the United States, we talk about American casualties far more often than we talk about total casualties. And actually, this is kind of important. We nationalize death in that sense. Um, and if you're watching the news, you want to hear about the American casualties in Afghanistan or the American casualties in Iraq. Um, and we don't nearly as often talk about the total number of people who have died. Now, you might think, well, sure, obviously, but Americans should be concerned about our own people or whatever. Fine. But here's something to think about. When you're talking about war and trying to justify a policy of war, something that this country learned during Vietnam, I mean, Nixon learned, right, is that if too many people die, then the American public will stop supporting a war. But what Nixon understood was that it's not actually just too many people. If too many Americans die, then the public shifts, right? If a tremendous number of people die, it doesn't actually matter to the American voter as long as those people are not American, right? Um, this might be obvious, but it's actually quite a disturbing reality because you think, again, the lesson of Vietnam is there is a number of people at which you would say this war has to end today. This is done. It's too much. If the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, and by 2003, 100,000 Americans had died, that war would be over. It doesn't matter, right? It's like the way it doesn't matter. That war would be over, right? I mean, the American voter would not stand for that level of death. Right? If you look at the death toll estimates for the wars on terror in the Middle East, and specifically in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are talking about at least hundreds of thousands of people, right? At the absolute least. Um, why does this not have more of an effect politically? Why are people not disturbed by this? Well, because again, we read death and violence differently depending on nationality, right? If you're an Afghan national versus if you're an American national and you die, then your death is read differently in the United States, and in fact, much differently, right? We also do this with types of violence on the basis of how we label the subject of or the object of the violence. So, for example, the word terrorist. If you say terrorist, this is a kind of person, right? But this actually changes the way we talk about violence. If I say, is it okay to torture a person? I would hope most people would say, no, it's not okay to torture a person. But if you say, is it okay to torture a terrorist? This becomes a different kind of question. Because even though all terrorists, of course, are people, because it's a way of describing a person, um, it changes because terrorist has the kind of air of being subhuman, right? Of being less than human. And anything that is read as less than human, any person read as less than human. Um, New and worse kinds of violences can be sort of enacted on that person, and it's less reprehensible. We've done this for a long time. I mean, you go back into the annals of the British Empire, and you'll find the word native, of course. And 100 years ago, if you were talking about, or much less than that, really, but if you're talking 100 years ago about, bombing, native peoples and exercising violence against native peoples, um, horrendous kinds of violences could be justified solely on the basis of the fact that the targets of that violence were natives. In a way that you would never be able to justify for a metropolitan European area. Perhaps until World War II. Um, I mean, don't forget Amy Cesar's great discourse on colonialism, his wonderful essay, where he basically argues that Nazism was an example of colonial violence coming home. It was an example of kinds of violences which had been practiced in the colonies coming home to Europe. And of course, the unique horror of this. But the reality was, of course, things like aerial bombardment, which we talk about a lot in the context of World War II and to a lesser extent World War I. Aerial bombardment had been used against colonized people already for a very long time. But the absolute horror of this technique is not fully faced until it's done basically by Europeans against other Europeans. So, we have to think about this. I mean, another example of differences in how we talk about violence, think about violence, is, structural versus individual violence. So if I'm living in a structure that is predicated on the use of violence versus I'm an individual person, I exercise violence as an individual. So I'm on the street somewhere, I'm just walking around, I beat someone up on the street. That is read very differently than if I'm in a prison and I'm a prisoner and a prison guard beats me up, right? Let's say both are totally arbitrary, right? But for whatever reason, me beating someone up in public, this is a more severe kind of crime of violence than is the prison guard beating up the prisoner. And let's keep in the prison, if I'm a prisoner in a prison and I lash out against a prison guard, right? I hate a prison guard. This is also read much differently than if the prison guard lashed out against the prisoner, even if they're both arbitrary or seem arbitrary. Because the reality is, if I'm a prisoner, I live in a violent system. If I'm in the carceral system, I live in a context predicated on, underwritten by violence, right? Everything that I do is structured by the fact that the threat of violence is all around me all the time, and that the structures of power are rooted in the ability of these people to use violence against me at any time and to justify it. Okay, so we need to start thinking about how we talk about violence when we're looking at structures of violence versus individual violence. And this is, of course, the problem we're having right now talking about police, is that people have a difficult time understanding the difference here between individual violence and state violence. Okay. Similarly, property, right? I mean, we have a difficult time talking about violence and talk about violence differently depending on if it's property or if it's people, and of course on context as well with other factors. If I'm someone protesting police murders and or the murders by police of unarmed civilians, and I take a chair and I smash a plate glass window, and then a police officer comes and beats me to a bloody pulp. Both of these are acts of violence. I've smashed the window, property damage, or I'm being smashed in my face or whatever. Human to human violence. Are these equivalents? Upon what basis do we determine the sort of relative justification of these things? We have to think about that, right? How many plate glass windows equal a human life? How many Wendy's equal a human life? Not an answerable question. And finally, of course, race has to do with this. And this goes back far. I mean, go back to the era of slave rebellions. The way that slave rebellion was often written about in the era of chattel slavery was, slave rebellions were these horrendous, awful, terrifying, the kind of, to use the horrible language of the times, kind of savagery of slave violence. It has seemed to escape the attention of white observers in the 19th century, in the 18th century, and before. that, of course, slavery is a system of violence underwritten by the practice of violence, either the threat or the actual enactment of it. So, if I am living in a society, if you're an enslaved person in a society where everything about the way that you live is predicated on the threat of violence against you or the acts of violence against you, and then you act violently against your captors, for whatever reason, white observers at the time read that act by enslaved people of violence as the problem. That was the real violence, but you don't read the system as being violent. So we have a long history of kind of ignoring the ways that the structures of our society are underwritten by violence, and instead focusing on individual acts of violence and sort of making these seem like contextless. Okay, so I want to dig deeper into this and ask the question. All of this in mind, then what actually mediates our moral reactions to violent actions? What are the sort of frameworks of mind that actually mediate how we approach the subject of violence? And the answer is pretty simple. It's what we call originality, right? Where did the violence start? Right? Who did the first violence? Because given this framework, the theory is whoever did the original act of violence is in the wrong, and then whoever is doing the sort of retaliatory act of violence is, if not in the right, they're more justified, right? Because they're acting in self-defense. This is the self-defense kind of doctrine. So then we have to get to the question of, okay, well, if we have different ways of talking about violence, then, in what sense are these discrepancies in our violence discourses tied to the question of originality and to assumptions about originality? And bear in mind, these are assumptions that are made very often unconsciously, right? Okay, so let's think about this. Go back to the prison thing. If I have a prisoner who is living in a context of violence, and then they act out violently, that act by the prisoner is treated as original. We talk about violence in prisons, and of course, prisons are incredibly violent places. And we say, what? Well, I mean, there's violence in prisons, and what is this? This is proof of the fact that these people ought to be in prison because they're violent. Right? What's not considered in that kind of discourse, that kind of framing, is, these are people living in a structure of violence. If you live in a world where your entire life is structured by the constant threat of violence on many levels, your response violence can't really be read as original, or shouldn't be read as original. It should be read as retaliatory. Similarly, if again, this kind of goes back to the policing question. If you live in a society that is really over policed, or where you're constantly afraid for your life, or whatever else, because of the history of law enforcement practices in this country, we need to think about what actually is the original violence then. Where is the point of origin, and what constitutes self-defense then? How stretchy are we willing to make that justificatory concept of self-defense? And by the way, again, it's important to realize this is not to say that anything which could fall under the category of retaliatory or self-defensive is justified. That isn't the question, right? The point is to dig into how we talk and think about these things, right? Because otherwise, we're not having a real discussion. It's not serious. If you're not willing to talk about the ways that our inherited and unconscious notions of originality structure how we talk about and think about violence and nonviolence, then you're not being serious, right? Then we're not really giving these issues the attention that they're due and the gravity that they're due. Okay, so when we think about violence, we either justify or condemn generally, but this is tied to our ideas about originality, which of course come out in all these different forms of how we talk about violence, and it ends up being that very oftentimes you have original violences by the state or by other actors, which are either not read as violence or read as justificatory. Okay. So, let's dig into this deeper then. So the next stage. So how can we start talking about violence in a more nuanced way? Well, let's take Dr. King's lead. Dr. King, I mean, very often we talk about violence, we take this very strange, like it's a binary, it's just violence, not violence. This is not accurate because we've just mentioned, right, self-defense. So Dr. King in the late 50s gave several speeches where he lays out this kind of three um, categories, right? Nonviolence, violent self-defense, and revolutionary violence, okay? And in order to understand the distinction here, we need to start thinking about this in the context of social movements in terms of theories of change, right? Not just reading an action, but thinking about what is the goal behind the action and what is the tactic being employed to get to that result. So let's dig into it. What is a nonviolent theory of change? Nonviolence is not merely the absence of violence. I mentioned this in a Facebook post a while back. If I'm sitting at I was having breakfast earlier, I was having some potatoes and some eggs. And I'm sitting at my kitchen table eating alone. I'm not murdering anybody. Is this an act of nonviolence? No, right? It's nothing. It's not. It's this. Nonviolence does not just mean the absence of violence. I'm not doing violence. Nonviolence is a particular theory of change. It has to do with civil disobedience, direct action. A nonviolent theory of societal change is basically non-cooperation. If you have an unjust or oppressive system, which you participate in either actively or tacitly, then your way of fighting back against that system is to not cooperate with it, right? If every soldier in a war said, no, we won't, and they put their guns down, right? You can't have a war then. It's not possible. You can't do it, right? If every eviction court judge in America, every single one of them, just refused to evict people for a day or something, that isn't going to happen. It's not going to happen. It can't, right? You're not hurting it. This isn't an act of violence, right? But by refusing to participate in the system, you are exerting pressure, right? I mean, you got to realize this. Nonviolence also isn't pretty always. Nonviolence is about disruption, oftentimes illegally, by the way. Nonviolence is about disrupting society, right? So that you have a kind of trend of oppressive action or behavior, and you interrupt that, right, by refusing to cooperate with the systems that enable that oppression or that violence. So if I mean things like the Montgomery bus boycott is an example of this, right? You put the squeeze on the wallets of the bus company through boycotting because of racist practices. Um, I mean, remember that of course in Montgomery it wasn't just a matter of you have to ride in the back of the bus or whatever. I mean, black people were constantly harassed. Um, by these bus drivers, and of course the humility and indignation of Jim Crow practices was just difficult to live with. And in addition to harassment and, by the way, violence as well by bus drivers, and all of the horrendous psychological damage of Jim Crow, saying we're just not going to use these buses is an act of it's forceful, right? I mean, it's nonviolent, but it's forceful, right? So if we think about nonviolence in that way, this complicates the violent self-defense idea, right? Because imagine that, you'll notice something about what I'm describing here, which is basically, it sounds a lot like the labor movement. It strikes, right? I mean, the labor movement is where a lot of the stuff comes from, right? I mean, it goes back further to slavery, really, but the idea of sort of refusing to cooperate as a way of exerting pressure, this is the principle of the labor movement, right? Well, let's take an example of that. If I'm in a factory and we're getting paid garbage money, and I say, look, I really need to get paid more money. We got to pay more money. We should go on strike. And everyone votes and say we're going to go on strike, so we go on strike, right? Let's say we say, okay, our strike is predicated on the idea that we don't work, and so the company doesn't make any money, and so they will feel the squeeze, and they will then have to come back and either give us what we want, or talk to us at least, right? But that only works. This is, by the way, clearly nonviolent. That only works if the factory is not running. So we say, look, we got to make sure there's no scabs. So we're going to occupy the factory, okay, and protect it. The theory of change is nonviolent. If the company comes back and says, we're going to send in Pinkertons, right, police officers, or National Guard, or the Army, whatever, we're going to send in people with guns to force you out of the factory so that I can get scabs in there so that we can make money again. The union's theory of change is still a nonviolent theory of change. But if the union membership says we have to get guns, and if the army or whoever it is comes to try and shut down the strike, we will defend ourselves with violence. If this is done, you can have death, right? You could have people actually get shot and killed on both sides. It's clearly an outbreak of violence. But what is the theory of change? Still nonviolent. I mean, the theory of change remains non-cooperation. In this case, this violence is clearly being exercised in self-defense, but it's even though it's violent, it's in the service of a fundamentally non-violent way of operating. Now, you might think, well, hold on a second, this means that all kinds of violence can be justified. No, because there's something else, another category, which is revolutionary violence. If I say we're going to raise an army and march on the State House and seize the apparatus of the state and sort of take over, whatever, that's using violence as your primary means, your primary tactic for getting the thing, right? This is how revolutions often run. Seizure of power through violence. Well, that is using violence as your primary tool. That's a violent theory of change, right? Which, by the way, anyone who's thinks the American Revolution was fine probably thinks that sometimes that's justified, right? However, that said, you can't really compare that conceptually to the example of the Union, because the Union wasn't using a violent theory of change. They were using a nonviolent theory of change, and the contextual factors pushed them into violence, right? And however the company wants to swing it, the original violence comes from the company, right? So, the point here, and I bring this up because Dr. King, of course, in those speeches in the 50s, said very plainly, look, every culture in the world accepts violence used in self-defense. This is clearly okay. And, even though he believed that the ultimate goal should be that people are practicing a kind of philosophical nonviolence, where they're really not, and this was Gandhi's position too. It's still understandable to King, of course, that people will have to use violence in self-defense because they don't want to get their heads bashed in, right? But that doesn't change the nonviolent core of their theory of change, the theory of social change, social movements, right? Okay. So, we need to understand, A, that nonviolence is not passive or timid or meek or actionless, right? Nonviolence is an active practice of disruption, right? Engaging with the problems of society in a big way, and the attempt is to make noise, is to disrupt and make splash. But that also we should understand that not all acts of violence should be read as revolutionary violence, which of course they're not. Violence used in self-defense is a different thing, and that doesn't change the underlying theory of change. And on top of that, we should think about the ways that differences in how we talk about violence allow us to read certain kinds of violent acts as, justified or unjustified. And we need to look at what lies underneath the motivations for using these designations. Why is it that some people are very fond of using the word terrorist when describing American foreign policy? To justify certain kinds of violences, we need to think about that. To what extent does race play a role in this, right? When you think about the discourse around policing in America, and you take this in the context of a cultural criminalization of black people over the whole history of the country going back to slavery, this changes things. And we have to be aware of how all of these different factors influence the ways we think and talk about violence. Okay. So, my concluding thoughts here are, it's not that I'm necessarily pointing to answers, right? However, I want everyone to be aware of the fact that if you are talking about violence and condemning violence or justifying violences, and you're not thinking about all these complicating factors, you're doing us all a disservice, right? If you just started realizing 2 weeks ago that it's not fine for the police to murder people who haven't done anything wrong, right? If this is something you're sort of just jumping on board with now, and then in the next breath you say, "Yeah, but you shouldn't burn a Wendy's." I mean, think about it. Again, it's not a matter of saying like I'm not interested in sitting here and making blanket statements about whether or not X act or X kind of act is justified or not. That doesn't really interest me. The point is, I really don't think the conversations that people are having about violence are honest. Because they're not taking into account our history, they're not taking into account all of these complicating factors that I've just laid out. So I would urge you that if you are going to engage in discourse about violence, that you do so in a way that is actually substantive, right? Because that's the only way we're going to get anywhere. And frankly, these are much more interesting conversations. So that's all I got for you today. This is a long one, but I think I'm going to come back and talk about. Well, there's a few things I'm juggling for the next installment, so we'll see about that. But anyway, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, you can message me or email me or put them in the comments on YouTube or whatever. And thanks for watching.